securities services sector generates the movement of large volumes and values of money. That's especially the case through settlement of securities trades, income events and corporate actions. But cybercriminals are increasingly targeting the securities industry. Their attacks are sophisticated and often executed over many months. Well, here to explain why this is happening and what the industry can do to protect itself, I'm joined in the studio by Mark Jem, who's Head of Compliance at Clearstream. He's also a member of the SWIFT board and chair of the ISO FCC working group. And also Jonathan Ehrenfeld, who's the Securities Market Manager at SWIFT and a member of the ISO working group for FCC. Gentlemen, welcome to Sibos TV. And Mark, can I start with you? There's nothing new about cyber threats, but how is the threat to the securities industry different to the threat posed to the banks themselves?
Well, it's not, is the simple answer, but it's sometimes overlooked. And our fear from ISA, as a trade association of all of the major banks in securities processing, also the market infrastructures that support those banks, is that when people think about their cyber defenses, when they think about what do we do if another bank that we are connected to gets compromised and ends up sending us fraudulent messages, then our fear is that people see that as purely a payments question. And we're saying, no, remember you have a securities business. Remember that the defenses need to cover the securities business as well. And just to give you an idea, Juliet, of how important that is, we think that something like 30% of all payments on the SWIFT network are related to securities.
30%?
30% by number.
Jonathan, I mean, that's quite a frightening thought to really contemplate. But I mean, look, from your perspective, why do you think the securities industry will become the target for financial crime and cyber attacks? 30% is the figure that's quoted here. That's food for thought. Yes,
I mean, you said it in the introduction. The security services sector generates huge amounts of cash in volumes and in value. I think that's the main reason. It makes it a very, very compelling case for criminals, right? The second reason I would say, it's looking at the evolution of the cyber attacks. You see an increase in the sophistication. It went from over the last 30 years from retail payments to credit card payments to institutional payments, and you see a progression of that sophistication going into maybe some things that are more complex, like securities industry. And I think that would be the main reason: the high volumes and values of cash in the security sector, and secondly, the fact that you have this sophistication of the attackers. I think a second thing would be also the very nature of the security sector. The attributes of the security sector makes it a very good target for criminals. It's a very complex with a lot of entry points, with critical central depositories, CCPs. And at the same time, there is a certain predictability to those cash movements we were discussing before. You have scheduled dividends, you have known maturities, you have known place of settlements, you know when the money is going to hit the account. So there are certain attributes to the whole industry which make an integral part of the industry that makes it also vulnerable for the attacker.
Yeah, and it's really the question of the motivation. Is it all just about stealing money, or does it go beyond that?
For some, yes. For some, the ultimate motivation is to steal money. It also could also be stealing data for different purposes, for ransom, for reputational damage. So there are different motivations. I think the most worrying motivation would be the one to actually disrupt the system, and that one it's worrying for the whole industry because of that complexity of the whole system. So if you manage to create disruption of the system, and that's your ultimate motivation, then that's worrying for everybody.
And you could basically hold a system hostage because you've disrupted it.
Yeah.
And Mark, financial systems, including securities, they're also at risk of being used for illicit purposes like money laundering and, of course, financing terrorism. So how is the industry evolving its response to these particular threats?
I mean, if we stay with money laundering and terrorist financing, the ground zero of that question, if we wind back 10 or 15 years, was payments. In other words, when a payment is being made from a person or a company in one part of the world to another, was that payment violating sanctions? Was that payment in some sense furthering the aims of criminal parties? And that led to a lot of innovation, principally by a group of banks known as the Wolfsburg Group, that evolved standards around payments. Anyone in this space is very, very familiar with all of the prescriptions of the Wolfsburg Group. And the key innovation was to identify exactly who was remitting the payment and exactly who was receiving it. So all the correspondent banks in the chain could make sure that that payment didn't violate their rules, etc. The problem in that discussion was that people focused on the movements of cash and not on the movements of other kinds of assets. And going back now, really it was Sibos in Boston, I think, in 2014, we all focused as a securities industry on, oh, it can happen to us too. And at that time, there were a couple of enforcement actions, one against my own firm and another, in which the American enforcement authorities said, essentially, even though you are not the account-holding bank, you are only servicing another bank, which is servicing the bad guy, we're going to go after you, even though you didn't know who his customer was. And so we said, what are we going to do about that? And we've been working really with the key banks, I would say, covering banks that cover something like 95% of all cross-border, what we call intermediated securities chains, meaning to hold securities in one country that have been issued in another, you've got to use one of these banks. Then we evolved principles, due diligence standards, and a risk-based approach, which is in some ways quite different from what had happened in the payments and is adapted to the particular vulnerabilities of securities. And for people who doubt that securities is really about money laundering, let me just put it to you this way. If you've managed to steal, and I'm not suggesting you would, but if you decided you would steal really a lot of money, I don't mean a small amount like 10 or 20 million, I mean a lot of money, you would have to pretend to invest it in something, and you would have to pretend to have received an investment from someone. In other words, you would have to use securities.
Okay, and Jonathan, just taking the much broader view, how can SWIFT help the securities industry to combat these cyber attacks and cybercrime? Because as you said, the attacks are very, very sophisticated, and it puts pressure on innocent bystanders caught in this, unaware of what's going on. So what can be done to help them?
I mean, first of all, because of the systemic risk that I was mentioning before, we have world-class security of our network. That's the first point. I think the second point would be that our customer security program, it's completely agnostic to the activity of the firm that needs to apply it, whether you're doing securities, post-trade, whether you're doing payments or only banking, it's completely agnostic to the instruments, to the customer type, to the segment, to the business that you're in. So it applies to everybody to actually enforce all the security guidelines of that program. That would be the first thing. And then the second thing, it's a little bit more reactive. It's based to that shift in focus of the regulation and the issuance of those principles. SWIFT has tried to match the services that we have in compliance to the principles. So our KYC registry actually takes into account the due diligence questionnaire of the ESA principles. Our name screening service to actually monitor the customers that are entering into the omnibus accounts of a custodian, for instance, is also taking into consideration those principles. So we try to match our services to the principles so that when you read a principle, when you read a guideline, you can actually find an actual solution to apply those principles and comply to the relevant regulation. I think the last point would be that if you look at some of the services that we have that are a lot geared into the payment space, and we come back to what we were saying before, that 30% of all those payments are done by securities firms. So services like payments control or payments data quality services where you monitor the actual payment are not only relevant to banks, but they're also relevant to securities firms, so to asset managers, to broker dealers, or to market infrastructures, because in the end they also generate huge amounts of cash movements, which are translated into actual payments into our network.
So this is a huge subject and one which has attracted a lot of attention for obvious reasons. But look, Mark, it's also a session in the conference. So what were the key discussion points that you focused on?
We had a fascinating discussion, actually. And we had, I think, over 100 people come, which was super for a subject which many would consider quite arcane. And the key messages were that the leading banks in the space are all committed to these standards. They're starting to apply them. It means already that differences are being made. The panel felt that something like 1 MDB would have been much more difficult to execute now, with the sorts of standards that people are looking at. Some of the bigger kleptocracy things that we've seen, perhaps out of Venezuela or out of Brazil, perhaps would have been more difficult had people been applying these principles. So there was a real sense that we're at least have made big strides at making the industry less vulnerable to money laundering, making securities less easily available to criminals, in particular in high-value corruption cases. There was a real sense that the regulators are on our wavelength with a risk-based and a standards-based approach. FATF is about to produce outcomes from its recent plenary session, and FATF will come, we believe, with an update to its views on the securities industry, which they haven't really said anything about since 2009. And we are very hopeful, very optimistic that the approach that we've been taking will be endorsed at that level, and that would be great. So these were really the key messages. It's making a practical difference. The regulators behind us, and we're making the world a safer place. The challenge now, and partly why we're here, is to make sure that all of the financial institutions around the world who participate in this system are aware of these requirements, aware of the tools that people like SWIFT are making available to help you across the line. So now it's all about communication. It's all about telling our customers, telling our correspondents, telling other infrastructures, this is where we're at.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on Sibos TV. Thank you.